Hi again. Dwight Wilson, page 140 of Armageddon now, dealing with the various Christian reactions to the birth of Israel in 1948. The liberal Protestant press had not welcomed the establishment of the new state of Israel. The Christian Century quoted the analysis of the executive secretary of the Southern Baptist Conference, who, as a conservative Christian, did believe in a special relationship of Jews to God, but nonetheless felt criticism of Israel was warranted. Quote, "The new nation Israel is a miracle. In honesty, I must add that it is an immoral miracle." End of quote. The Liberal Journal claimed that the words immoral miracle summed up what the editors had been saying about the new nation. However, the majority of American popular opinion was in a general way favorable towards Israel. Nadav Safran in the United States and Israel lists the reasons that most Americans supported Israel rather than the Arabs. First, nationalistic self-determination gave the Jews a right to exist. Second, the Jews were underdogs due to persecution. Third, Jewish propaganda overwhelmed Arab views. Fourth, democracy was preferred over totalitarianism. 5, Americans felt akin to the Jewish pioneering spirit. And 6, the drive for achievement was admired. It may be added that anti-Semites preferred that Jews have their own state rather than immigrate to the United States. Even apart from premillenarianism, Safran points out that Americans gave priority in Palestine to Jews because of their direct association with the Bible, rather than to the Arabs, about whom they knew very little. An example of this is the strong non-millenarian stance expressed by Representative Helen Gahagan Douglas. Quote, "Jews in Palestine today are making the Bible's prophecies come true." End of quote. So the premillenarians did not have a monopoly on Christian support for Israel. What was unique was their deterministic, non-moral approach and their eagerness. This eagerness was not expressed in direct political action on Israel's behalf, but rather this greatest event was heralded in press and pulpit as a sure sign of the end, the greatest event being a reference to the chapter's heading, by the way, the century's greatest event. This sure sign of the end to goad Christians into action and sinners into the kingdom. D. Malcolm Leith, in his study of Christian support for the State of Israel, claims that although premillenarians took no political action, their arguments provided a rationale for support of the humanitarian appeal that was characteristic of Christian action groups such as the American Palestine Committee and the Christian Committee on Palestine. Various sidelights of the premillenarian preoccupation with Israel continued to be manifest, such as the latter rain, the Allenby legend, the development of Palestine, and the rebuilding of the temple. Lewis T. Talbot recounted that for years the early rains had been insufficient and the latter rains had been of little value. But a few years ago the latter rains had been increased so that the land in some places was able to produce 3 crops a year. The Evangel tied the origin of this miraculous change in climate to the first meeting of the Zionist Congress in 1897. In the style of a true storyteller, Lewis S. Bauman passed along the emerging legend of General Allenby and the fall of Jerusalem in 1917. Quote, "It was 1917. Out of Egypt marched a long line of British Tommies. At the head of that line marched the British General Allenby. 'Allah Bey, prophet of God,' cried the Turkish soldiers in Jerusalem. When a leader of that name comes, Jerusalem must go back to the Jews." For such had been a tradition of the Muslim priesthood for centuries. The Turks decided not to waste their ammunition. Without firing a shot, they took to their heels, headed for Constantinople. End of quote. The miraculous blossoming of the desert like a rose was recounted as a sure sign of the times. The discovery of oil was hailed as God's provision for his chosen people. It would give them prestige among the industrial nations of the world. The purchase of land, for agricultural development was depicted as a fulfillment of Jeremiah 32, verse 44. Men shall buy fields for money, for I will cause their captivity to return, saith the Lord. Actually, the land had been confiscated without consent from Arab refugees who had not been permitted to return home. The rumor of the impending reconstruction of the temple continued to be echoed. During the war, Dawn reported that all parts of the building had been completed in accordance with a plan by architect G.S. Schick, whose model temple had been exhibited at the Chicago's World Fair in 1934, and these parts were being stored in various cities in America and Europe, waiting shipment to Jerusalem. Starting in July 1947, every Jew was reportedly asked to contribute 1 shekel toward the reconstruction. As British withdrawal from Jerusalem approached, it was anticipated that some irresponsible Jews, that's a quote, might destroy the Mosque of Omar. The evangelical Christian reported that a Talmudic seminary in Jerusalem secretly studied animal sacrifice and that the temple was soon to be rebuilt. The leader of the Irgun was quoted as saying, quote, "The third temple, as outlined by Ezekiel, will assuredly be rebuilt in our own generation," end of quote. On Israel's first anniversary, the editor of Alliance Weekly predicted, "The temple is not yet rebuilt, but it will soon appear in magnificence, largely subscribed for by American Jewry," end of quote. The record has amply demonstrated that the premillenarian philosophy of history to be deterministic. Mechanistic figures of speech were used, such as cogs in a machine or stars in their courses. Figures of natural law, such as the certainty of waves upon the seashore, were also used. But the metaphor of invisible hands did not imply natural law at work, as it did to economist Adam Smith back in 1776. It meant the direct, manipulative action of a personal God in history. It entailed more than just the intervention of God in the course of history. It depicted God's plan as embodied in the whole of history. This is perhaps understandable in the case of those premillenarians who came out of the Calvinistic, deterministic tradition, such as expressed in the King's Business, but the Assemblies of God, publishers of the Evangel, tended to reflect an Arminian free will background. So even those who rejected predestination as a theological principle when applied to individual salvation used it as a philosophy of history when applied to nations. Although it is difficult to prove from direct statements, when one analyzes the premillenarians' response to Israel, the inescapable conclusion is that their philosophy of history, in many cases, is equivalent to the antinomian heresy. Antinomian means against law. If every action is preordained, then there is no need to measure one's actions by moral law, since the decision to obey or disobey the standard has already been made. If Israel is the elect, and Jewish history is predetermined by God and foretold by prophecy, then ordinary rules of international law, morality, do not apply to God's chosen people, and there is no absolute standard by which they can be judged. This is not implicit in the premillenarian view of prophecy, but it is what has worked out in practice in the response to Israel. Prophecy says that in the last days, evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse. That's 2 Timothy 3:13. Yet premillenarians do not cheer rising crime rates, even though they do interpret them as signs of the times. Neither should they cheer crimes against international law and against humanity, even if they believe them to be prophetic. As John Cumming reminded premillenarians back in 1855, quote, "God predicts in his word what he does not applaud in his law." Yes, I think that's a good standard to judge Israel's actions by. Not the we should say flourishing understanding in some circles that everything Israel does is to be not applauded, but at least tolerated because they are God's people. Obviously, God does not obey that law himself, because he has sent them into exile twice now for disobeying his law. So Christians are caught in a moral quandary indeed in this, because yes, it is said back in the 7 promises of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12, that he who curses Israel, that is, actually it's Abraham in the text, he who curses you will be cursed, and he who blesses you will be blessed. How to interpret that and how to apply it to modern day Israel is the problem. And it's an ongoing debate, because this book is written a generation back, and talking now about events 3 generations back. Now we're going to chapter 8, From Sinful Alliance to Christian Realism. I'll put in a link to a video we did on basic books on Bible prophecy. See you soon.